So welcome back to our conversations with Philip Clayton for what will be the final interview in what's really too short a series of dialogues.
Thank you, Peter. I very much enjoyed our conversation.
I'd like to turn to the issue of ecology,
Good.
because I think that for those who have followed your work, it has really become central in the last few years and very urgent in your perspective. Can you summarize a little bit of what you're doing and why you're doing it?
I remember the exact moment when it moved from important but peripheral to the center. My mentor, John Cobb, the process theologian, was giving a conversation about the seriousness of the problem, and he said, somebody said at one point, well, what will be the results? And he said early on, well, we could have the extinction of 70 to 80% of the world's species, that much of the world would become uninhabitable without drinking water, and that the deaths would be in the hundreds of millions, if not billions.
When did he say that?
2009.
Right.
His first book, Is It Too Late, was published in 1972.
Oh.
Is it too late? And at that point I thought, the abstract questions of my former work should be left behind, and I formed we had in 2015 a 2,000-person conference called Seizing an Alternative Toward an Ecological Civilization. So we formed a nonprofit, EcoCiv, toward ecological civilization. And now I work most of my time in bringing about these discussions around the world on what would be this kind of post-modern civilization.
A postmodern civilization implying a critique of the modern. So
Not only critique, the collapse of modern civilization, if I may, I think is now inevitable. And we should be preparing ourselves for whatever will come after.
now that's quite the statement, but clearly you believe it. What particular evidence, for those who don't necessarily share this point of view, would you point to?
Well, unfortunately, I think that science is the best predictor of the future. Unfortunately, because the predictions don't look good.
No.
The curves in at least 12 different areas show an increase since 1800, steeper and steeper, and the lines are becoming almost vertical. The thing about climate change is you set something in motion and it grows and grows in ways that you can't stop once you've started it. It's like the snowball that heads down the Alpine mountain,
Right.
and it grows and grows, and it can't be changed once the speed is high enough. That's why I think that we have such a serious difficulty, and we're not responding. Our response is, for example, the American President Trump, backwards. We're actually moving backwards.
Sure. But what happens to these lines that keep going up and up?
They mean that ecosystems collapse. And because we're so interdependent, intertwined with the world around us, that means massive extinctions, and it means massive loss of life. The planet, this new planet, Bill McKibben calls it Earth with two A's, because he wants to say it's no longer the same planet.
It's no longer the same planet, and that ties in quite strongly, I think, with a lot of work that's been happening in France about the notion of the Anthropocene, particularly with thinkers such as Bruno Latour, but also Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, I don't know if you know his name, Christophe Bonneuil. You mentioned 1800 as the date when things start to crank up in terms of human impact. What's that about?
Mm-hmm. 1800 crank up is the perfect metaphor, because it's the beginning of steam engines about
Right.
that time, and that means that we turn to an environment that more and more we create technologically. And I think the French discussion has shown this earlier than the American discussion, for example. As we change into a world that we, create through our technology, then our control over the environment increases. And that makes me wrong in two of the fundamental parts of my work as an environmental ethicist for 25 years. It means that I was wrong in the belief in deep ecology. That means that humans are relativized within a
Right.
deeper
Yeah, sure.
understanding of the community. and that is no longer possible. It's also called biocentrism, where the entire ecosystem becomes the center. But we now hold the future of the planet in our hands. Anthropocene means an entirely new age when anthropos, humanity, has this total control. We now, as awful as it sounds, determine the future state of this planet and all its inhabitants.
In other words, we've come of age.
Ooh, what an awful expression.
With an awful expression, but in a sense, the truth is there in the data.
That's like the child coming of age is a psychopath or a sociopath, because that's what we've turned out to be.
So what's the solution? What are some of the solutions? Obviously, that's a stupid question myself.
That's exactly the question. That's precisely the question. So now we hold the fate of the earth in our hands. Two paths diverge in a wood, says Robert Frost, and I chose the one less traveled. If we move, even the minority grow in their influence, then we have the chance to change, and as of today, possibly to avoid an unbelievable collapse. Take China, which is criticized, rightly, for its huge movement toward a Western consumption lifestyle. A minority in the government, some of us estimate up to a third, is fighting for China to become an ecological civilization. That means to jump from a pre-modern lifestyle across Western modernism, which has really been the bloody source of this crisis, to a postmodern civilization which is based on ecological principles. If that dominates in China, if it were to dominate in India, which I don't think, if it were to dominate in Europe, which is highly possible, the first steps are there, and if, God willing, it should become a strong response in the United States, we avoid the worst.
But it's a race against time, presumably.
It is precisely a race against time.
I'd like to move this on to another level, in a sense, but I think it's, again, it underpins, in a sense, the discussion that we're having here in a Catholic university, is that a lot of the thinkers that are using the word Anthropocene are also using, and these are secular thinkers, are using the word apocalypse. Not necessarily in a Christian sense, but in a sense that it's clearly also derived and in dialogue with the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, obviously, you come from America, where apocalyptic has certain connotations, particularly within evangelicalism, and that obviously these are things which are laughed about here in Europe, but which have profound social political implications because of the influence that these views have held within a big constituency in America. If I mention the word the rapture, could you unpack the rapture in 1 minute for people who don't know about this particular form of religious expression?
This is an awful doctrine which has had massive American following. It appeals back in the scripture to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and it says, and you will be caught up with him in the clouds. So it's a part of the second coming of Christ, and these lucky people then come down to an earth out of control. Christians maybe miss this terrible time of suffering on the planet and then return. The question is not the suffering. I believe that that's now become likely, but what comes after it. And there a different term is being used, dystopia and utopia. Extremely influential in written work and in film is this idea that we head into a dystopia. Zombies control the world, a virus kills many, the space invaders come, and each of those leads to a terrible result without hope at the end.
Hope, yeah.
A utopia says, however terrible the route is, there's something afterwards. Utopia could be humanist, that we do it by capacity of the human being, or it could be religious, that there's a second coming, there's a millennial age, and I actually think it can be done in either way. I'm on the side of utopia, and actually through human effort, so I have to admit my humanist side, that we can bring about an ecological age. The trouble is, who's the we? it won't be
Sure.
7.2 billion people. I'm afraid it will be much fewer.
Well, I mean, that's a very chilling perspective in a way. But what if I throw out this idea that it could be both?
Oh, good. Tell me more.
Because I think that obviously a lot of us react very negatively to the role that the idea of certainly the pre-tribulation rapture, the pre-trib rapture, as a really offensive idea, not just for ecological reasons, but for also reasons of pure humanity.
Yes.
Is that it seems to be to go hand in hand with a complete lack of compassion
Yes.
for the vast majority of people in the world.
Doesn't it sounds like a God who doesn't care?
It sounds like a God who doesn't care, or who actually actively takes pleasure in destruction, and a whole range of things which I think for many of us who don't hold to this kind of beliefs are completely unacceptable. However, the notion of utopia, of course, has got a bad press.
I agree.
Because the word has become used so badly. So that the idea of hoping for something against hope, against the statistics, again becomes something countercultural. And even within Christianity, there are a lot of thinkers who, even if they were prepared to countenance the idea of the apocalypse, and René Girard, for example, was in his last period was very outspoken in saying he believes these are the times of the apocalypse, and that the church's, in a sense, credibility is going to come back into play because of actually what's happening, which is a remarkable thing for him to say. But he said basically there's nothing we can do about it, that sort of resignation of it. Now, what about the idea, which is certainly present in Catholic thought, and particularly in Catholic mystical thought, that there's a kind of synergy between the promise of an era of peace, yes, and human prayer, human preparation for living by certain standards of the kingdom, in the sense of the Gospels, in the sense of the meek shall inherit the earth, and that it's not that we are facing the end of all things, but that, like Paul writes, you're facing the birth pains, in a sense that, terrible that the process is, that there's a maturation there is a coming of age of humanity, in the good and the bad sense, is that you have the psychopath, but you also have a great, I think, there's a lot of evidence for a great upsurge in compassion and understanding.
So I think we could actually take that, much of which I agree with, and extend it with another Christian notion of the already and the not yet.
Exactly.
So the not yet is a state where all shall be one, and all shall be one, and all manner of things shall be one, Gillian of Norwich. And then that's the one hope of faith, the core Christian hope, right? Without this hope, you are of all men most to be pitied,
Yes.
right? But the already is to say, through prayer and through the alignment of the self, we can begin to live in the world in a different way. For me, that's, as a follower of John Wesley, that's a strong attraction to the statement of grace. So if we live in this way, anticipating that final outcome, Pannenberg, then we may well avoid the worst of the consequences. By grace and transformation of the individual from self-interest to the interest of the common good.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Philip Clayton.
Thank you, Peter.